In the annals of human history, few minds shine as brightly or as mysteriously as Leonardo da Vinci. To call him merely the painter of the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper is to glimpse only the surface of an infinite ocean. Leonardo was the archetype of the Renaissance man, an inventor, an atomist, engineer, musician, and philosopher whose curiosity was a force of nature, driving him to explore every corner of the known and unknown world. The infinite canvas, unraveling the genius of Leonardo da Vinci, does more than recount dates and locations. It maps the topography of a mind that saw no boundary between art and science. To him, the swirl of a river and the curl of a woman's hair were governed by the same divine geometry. His notebooks, thousands of pages in dense, mirrored script, brimming with sketches of flying machines, fortresses, and anatomical dissections, reveal a consciousness ceaselessly probing the mechanics of the universe. Born illegitimate in the Tuscan hills of Vinci, Leonardo rose from humble beginnings to the courts of Florence, Milan, and finally France, leaving traces of his brilliance wherever he went. He dissected corpses to capture the human form perfectly, studied birds to design flying machines, and measured water to engineer cities centuries ahead of their time. His true masterpiece was not a painting hanging in a museum, it was the way he thought. Relentlessly curious, skeptical of convention, and brave enough to ask why when others settled for because. This book invites you to walk beside him through candlelit workshops, bustling streets, and laboratories of imagination. You will witness a mind that fused art and science into a single vision, a life lived on the edge of possibility, and a legacy that continues to challenge us to see the world differently. Leonardo da Vinci teaches that the universe is not a collection of separate subjects to be memorized. It is an infinite canvas, waiting for those daring enough to observe, question, and create. Chapter 1. Born in Vinci, Childhood and Early Curiosity. The story of the world's most renowned polymath begins not in a grand palace or a bustling metropolis, but in the quiet, undulating hills of Tuscany. On April 15, 1452, in the deeper hours of the night, Leonardo was born in the small hill town of Vinci, situated in the valley of the Arno River. His entrance into the world was marked by the complication of illegitimacy. He was the son of Supero da Vinci, an ambitious and somewhat ruthless notary from a prominent local family, and Caterina, a peasant woman of humble origins, arguably orphaned and destitute. This distinction of birth, being born senza famiglia, or without the legal standing of a legitimate heir, would ironically become the first stroke of fortune in Leonardo's life. Had he been a legitimate son, he would likely have been funneled into the family trade, forced into the rigid, text-heavy life of a notary. Instead, his illegitimacy liberated him. He was barred from the formal Latin schools and university training that churned out doctors and lawyers, leaving him free to pursue a different kind of education, one authored by nature itself. Leonardo's early years were spent in the hamlet of Onciano, and later in the household of his paternal grandfather. In Vinci, the Tuscan landscape that surrounded him was not merely a backdrop. It was his first tutor. The hills were terraced with olive groves and vineyards, the streams rushed over smooth stones, and the light possessed a golden clarity that would later permeate his paintings. It was here, as a solitary child wandering the countryside, that Leonardo began to develop the habits of intense observation that would define his genius. He did not just look, he scrutinized. He watched the way a dragonfly's wings shimmered in the sunlight, the spiral patterns of snail shells, and the chaotic yet rhythmic turbulence of water flowing into a pool. One of the few anecdotes Leonardo recorded about his childhood involves a kite, a bird of prey similar to a hawk. He recalled lying in his cradle when a kite flew down, opened his mouth with its tail, and struck him many times with its tail inside his lips. Whether this was a genuine memory, a dream, or a later fabrication designed to mythologize his destiny, it speaks to his lifelong obsession with flight and his deep, almost primal connection to the avian world. He saw birds not just as animals, but as supreme engineers of the air, possessing a secret knowledge of aerodynamics that he was determined to unlock. Because he lacked formal schooling in Greek and Latin, Leonardo referred to himself as an homo sans a letter and unlettered man. However, this self-deprecation masked a fierce intellectual independence, while the scholars of his day relied on the dusty authority of ancient texts. Citing Aristotle and Plato to explain the world, Leonardo relied on Spirian's experience. His childhood was a continuous experiment. He would ask questions that most adults had long ceased to consider. Why is the sky blue? How do clouds form? Why does thunder follow lightning? In the solitude of the Vinci countryside, he learned to trust his eyes over the dogmatic assertions of the church or the academy. His relationship with his father, Sir Piero, was complex, though Piero eventually married 4 times and produced legitimate heirs much later in life. During Leonardo's youth, the boy was treated with a mix of affection and distance. Piero recognized the boy's talent early on. Legend holds that a local peasant asked Sir Piero to have a buckler, a small round shield, painted. Piero gave the job to his son. Leonardo, inspired by the terrifying beasts of mythology and his own observations of lizards, bats, and insects, painted a monster exhaling smoke and poison. The result was so visceral and terrifying that Sir Piero was astounded. He secretly sold the shield to a Florentine merchant for a handsome sum, and bought the peasant a cheap, mass-produced shield instead. This story, apocryphal or not, illustrates that even as a child, Leonardo possessed the ability to synthesize the natural world into something fantastical and emotionally potent. By the time Leonardo was a teenager, the limitations of Vinci were becoming apparent. His mind was too vast for the village, his talents too explosive for the rural quiet. The notary Sir Piero, recognizing that his son's aptitude for drawing and observation was exceptional, made the decisive move to take Leonardo to Florence. This was the epicenter of the Quattrocento, a city bursting with commerce, art, and intellectual fervor. The move from the quiet hills of Vinci to the bustling streets of Florence marked the end of his childhood isolation and the beginning of his formal integration into the artistic machinery of the Renaissance. Yet, the lessons of Vinci, the reliance on observation, the love of nature's patterns, and the freedom of the unlettered mind remained the bedrock of his consciousness. The child who watched the water swirl in the Arno was already the architect of the genius who would one day design locks for canals and paint the background of the Mona Lisa. Chapter 2: Apprenticeship in Florence, learning from the masters. In the late 1460s, Florence was the crucible of the Renaissance, a city-state ruled by the wealthy Medici family, where bankers patronized poets and wool merchants commissioned cathedrals. Into this vibrant, competitive atmosphere stepped the young Leonardo, brought by his father to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was not merely a painter, he was a master craftsman, a sculptor, a goldsmith, and an engineer. His Bottega workshop was a commercial enterprise that churned out everything, from Madonna paintings to ceremonial armor and church bells. For Leonardo, this environment was far superior to any university. It was a laboratory of practical skills, where art was treated as a mechanical science. Entering the guild system as a Garzoni studio boy, Leonardo's education was rigorous and multifaceted. He did not begin by painting masterpieces, he began by sweeping floors, grinding pigments, preparing wooden panels with gesso, and polishing bronze. This grounding in the materiality of art was crucial. Leonardo learned the chemistry of colors, which minerals created the deepest blues, which oils allowed for the smoothest glazes. He learned the physics of sculpture, how to cast molten bronze without it cracking, how to balance a heavy statue on a precarious base. The workshop was a collaborative hive. He worked alongside other future masters like Sandro Botticelli and Pietro Perugino. They competed, collaborated, and critiqued one another, sharpening their skills on the whetstone of rivalry. Verrocchio was a demanding master, renowned for his emphasis on anatomical precision and movement. He insisted that his students study the human figure in motion, understanding the underlying structure of bone and muscle that dictated the surface form. This instruction resonated deeply with Leonardo. He began to fill sketchbooks with studies, of drapery, carefully rendering the play of light and shadow on folded cloth. These early drawings reveal a startling obsession with three-dimensionality. Leonardo was not content with flat outlines. He wanted his figures to occupy space, to breathe. He pioneered the use of sfumato, a technique of blurring sharp edges, to create a smoky, atmospheric effect even in these early stages, softening the transition between light and dark to mimic the way the human eye actually perceives the world. The pivotal moment of Leonardo's apprenticeship, and arguably the moment he surpassed his master, occurred around 1475. During the creation of the Baptism of Christ, Verrocchio had been commissioned to paint this large altarpiece, and as was the custom, he assigned parts of the work to his assistants. Leonardo was tasked with painting one of the angels holding Christ's robe, as well as parts of the landscape background. When the work was unveiled, the difference between the master's hand and the apprentice's was glaring. Verrocchio's figures were competent, solid and somewhat stiff, painted in the traditional egg tempera, which dried quickly and allowed for little blending. Leonardo's angel, painted in the newer medium of oil, was ethereal. The face glowed with a divine inner light, the hair curled with impossible delicacy, and the eyes held a complexity of expression that Verrocchio had never achieved. The landscape behind the angel, too, was different, misty, atmospheric and geologically accurate, contrasting with the stylized rocks of the older style. Legend has it that upon seeing Leonardo's angel, Verrocchio put down his brush and vowed never to paint again. While likely an exaggeration, it symbolizes the passing of the torch. However, Leonardo's time in Florence was not without peril. In 1476, he was anonymously accused of sodomy, a serious crime in Florence, involving a young male prostitute named Jacopo Saltarelli. Leonardo and 3 others were investigated by the officers of the Knight and monasteries. While the charges were eventually dropped for lack of witnesses, the experience was traumatic. It likely reinforced his secretive nature and his habit of recording his thoughts in code. It also highlights the social environment of Florence, a place of high culture, but also intense scrutiny and intrigue. Despite the scandal, Leonardo's reputation grew. He became a master in the Guild of St. Luke in 1472, but continued to work with Verrocchio, a testament to his loyalty and his recognition that he still had much to learn about engineering and sculpture. During this period, he also began his first independent commissions, such as the Adoration of the Magi for the monks of San Donato a Scopito. This work, though left unfinished, a recurring theme in his life, showed the chaotic energy of his mind. It was a swirling vortex of figures, animals, and architectural ruins, displaying a mastery of composition and emotional dynamism that was revolutionary. By the time he approached his 30s, Leonardo had absorbed everything Florence could teach him. He had mastered the chemistry of paint, the geometry of perspective, and the mechanics of casting, but he was growing restless. The highly competitive, commercially driven art market of Florence, with its demands for finished products and adherence to deadlines, chafed against his perfectionism and his desire for deep, slow research. He began to look beyond the Arno toward Milan, where a warlord named Ludovico Sforza was building a court that valued military engineering as much as painting. Leonardo prepared to leave the Republic of Bankers for the Duchy of Soldiers, carrying with him the skills of a craftsman and the mind of a visionary. Chapter 3: The Mind of Observation, Nature, People and Science. To understand Leonardo da Vinci, one must understand the fundamental mechanism of his intellect, the eye. For Leonardo, the eye was not merely a passive organ for receiving light. It was the window of the soul and the primary instrument of scientific inquiry. In an era before the scientific method was codified, Leonardo practiced a rigorous empiricism. He believed that all knowledge stemmed from direct observation of the physical world. This chapter explores how his mind of observation deconstructed the universe into patterns, forces and analogies, breaking down the barriers between the organic and the inorganic. Leonardo's approach to nature was microscopic in its intensity. He did not simply paint a flower. He studied the botany of its growth, the way its stem branched, and how it turned toward the sun heliotropism. His notebooks are filled with drawings of plants that are scientific diagrams masquerading as art. He observed the branching of trees and formulated Leonardo's rule, which states that the combined cross-sectional area of the daughter branches is equal to the cross-sectional area of the mother trunk. This was not an aesthetic choice, but a hydraulic one. He realized that trees were conduits for sap, just as rivers were conduits for water and arteries were conduits for blood. This interconnectedness was central to his philosophy. He viewed the earth as a microcosm of the human body. He wrote, "The earth has a spirit of growth, and its flesh is the soil. Its bones are the arrangement of the connections of the rocks. Its blood is the veins of the waters." This analogical thinking drove his scientific inquiries. When he studied the flow of water, sketching the whirls and eddies of a river crashing into a pool, he compared the turbulence to the curling of hair. He used his observations of water dynamics to understand the movement of blood in the heart. Valves, a leap of logic that was centuries ahead of medical science. He was fascinated by the spiral, seeing it in the shell of a nautilus, the formation of a storm, and the growth of plants. To Leonardo, these repeating patterns were the fingerprints of nature's laws. His observation of people was equally relentless and often bordered on the obsessive. Leonardo was known to stalk interesting faces through the streets of Milan or Florence. If he saw a person with a peculiar nose, a jutting chin, or a unique expression, he would follow them for hours, memorizing their features, and then rush home to sketch them. These grotesques or caricatures serve as a counterpoint to his idealized beauty. They reveal his fascination with the extremes of nature. The ugly, the old, and the deformed were just as worthy of study as the beautiful and the young. He realized that emotion manifested physically in the muscles of the face. He would observe men telling jokes, arguing, or weeping, cataloging which muscles contracted to pull the lips or furrow the brow. This data was then fed into his art, allowing him to paint the Last Supper not as a static lineup of saints, but as a psychological drama where every hand gesture and facial ripple conveyed a specific reaction to Christ's statement, "One of you will betray me." Furthermore, Leonardo's science was not a cold, detached collection of facts. It was visual and descriptive. He developed a unique method of technical drawing, inventing the exploded view, which allowed him to show the internal components of a machine or a limb as if they were suspended in space. This required a mind capable of visualizing complex 3D structures and rotating them mentally. He studied the phenomenon of light and shadow, optics, and perspective with the rigor of a physicist. He noticed that the atmosphere is not transparent, but has substance and color, leading him to formulate the concept of aerial perspective, the idea that distant objects appear bluer and less distinct. This observation changed the course of Western art, introducing depth and realism that had never been seen before. However, his observational method had a drawback: distraction. The world was too interesting. A study of a painting's composition might lead to a study of geometry, which might lead to a study of light, then to the anatomy of the eye, and finally to the dissection of a bull's eye to understand the lens. This rhizomatic wandering meant that many projects were started and abandoned. Yet, to view this as a failure is to misunderstand his goal. Leonardo was not seeking to produce products. He was seeking to understand causes. His journals were a dialogue with nature, whether he was noting the way a bird's tail acted as a rudder or how sound waves propagated like ripples in water. He was building a unified theory of the world. He taught us that to truly see is to question, and that the mundane details of life, a bubble in water, a leaf falling, a smile, hold the secrets of the universe if one only has the patience to look. Chapter 4. Art Meets Anatomy, Sketching the Human Form. The synthesis of art and science in Leonardo da Vinci's work finds its most visceral expression in his anatomical studies. While many Renaissance artists studied anatomy to improve their depiction of the human figure, usually focusing on surface musculature, Leonardo's ambition went for deeper. He did not just want to know what the body looked like. He wanted to know how it worked. He sought the mechanical and spiritual center of humanity. Chapter 4 delves into the candlelit, often macabre world of Leonardo's dissections, revealing how he transformed the study of the dead into a celebration of the living. Leonardo's initial interest in anatomy was indeed artistic. Under Verrocchio, he learned that to paint the skin, one must understand the muscles beneath. But as his scientific curiosity grew, the why superseded the how. He began to view the human body as the ultimate machine. Designed by nature with an efficiency that no human engineer could match, he famously wrote, "Let no one who is not a mathematician read my elements, applying the principles of leverage, pulleys and hydraulics to the limbs and organs of man." His anatomical career can be divided into distinct phases, but the most intense period occurred later in his life, particularly during his time in Milan and later in Rome, where he collaborated with Marcantonio della Torre, a professor of anatomy. Accessing bodies was difficult and taboo. Dissection was a messy, smelly, and spiritually dangerous business, often restricted to the bodies of executed criminals. Leonardo claimed to have dissected over 30 corpses in his lifetime. He worked in the dead of night to avoid the heat that would hasten decomposition, enduring what he described as the fear of living in the night hours, in the company of these quartered and flayed corpses. Fearful to behold, yet the drawings that resulted from these grim sessions are among the most beautiful in the history of art. The Vitruvian Man, arguably his most famous drawing, is a study of proportion, placing man within the geometry of the circle and the square, a symbol of the human connection to the cosmos. But his detailed anatomical sheets are even more revealing. He was the first to accurately depict the curvature of the human spine. He drew the heart not as a symbolic valentine, but as a muscular pump, correctly identifying the chambers and describing the hydrodynamic function of the aortic valve, a mechanism not fully understood by modern medicine until the 20th century. He poured wax into the ventricles of an ox brain to model its shape, an early form of casting that allowed him to visualize the internal cavities of the brain. One of his most profound studies involved the dissection of a centenarian he met in a hospital in Florence. The old man claimed to have no pain, only weakness, before passing away peacefully. Leonardo dissected him to find the cause of so sweet a death. He discovered the narrowing of the arteries atherosclerosis and described it with clinical precision, noting how the blood supply to the heart had been restricted. In the same period, he dissected a 2-year-old child, comparing the straight, flexible arteries of the youth with the tortuous, calcified vessels of the elder. This comparative anatomy was revolutionary. Leonardo also sought the seat of the soul. He believed it resided in the brain, specifically in the area where the sensory inputs converged, which he called the sensor commune. His drawings of the skull were not just structural, they were a search for the physical location of consciousness. He peeled back the facial layer by layer, showing the muscles of expression. He drew the lips, noting the specific muscles that pull them into a smile or a sneer, directly informing the enigmatic expression of the Mona Lisa. That painting is, in essence, an anatomical study draped in silk. The smile is the result of Leonardo's knowledge of the underlying muscular structure. Crucially, Leonardo also studied the anatomy of reproduction. His drawings of the fetus in the womb are iconic. Although they contain errors, he depicted the human uterus somewhat like that of a cow. Based on animal dissections, the image of the unborn child, curled in the womb, calling it the Great Mystery, is a masterpiece of observation and empathy. He depicted the fetus not as a homunculus, a tiny adult, but as a developing being. Leonardo intended to publish a treatise on anatomy, a work that would have revolutionized medicine centuries before. Vesalius, tragically, like so many of his projects, it was never finished. The notes were left in disarray after his death, lost to science for hundreds of years. Had they been published, the history of medicine would have been rewritten. Yet, these drawings remain as a testament to his belief that the human body is a masterpiece of engineering. In slicing through the flesh, Leonardo did not reduce the human form to mere meat, he elevated it, revealing the divine complexity hidden beneath the skin. Chapter 5: Engineering Dreams, Machines Beyond His Time. If Leonardo's art captured the soul of the Renaissance, His engineering anticipated the pulse of the Industrial Revolution. While the world remembers him as a painter, his contemporaries often hired him as a military engineer and architect. He lived in a fractured Italy, a patchwork of warring city-states where the difference between survival and conquest often lay in superior technology. Chapter 5 explores Leonardo the inventor, the man who dreamed of tanks, submarines, and automation in an age of horses and pikes. Leonardo's approach to engineering was rooted in his core philosophy, mimic nature. He believed that nature had already solved every mechanical problem. If he wanted to build a flying machine, he studied birds. If he wanted to build a submarine, he studied fish. This biomimicry set him apart from the brute force engineers of his time. However, his designs were also fueled by a fantastical imagination. He viewed the machine not just as a tool, but as an extension of human will. Upon seeking employment with Ludovico Sforza in Milan, Leonardo wrote a famous letter, essentially a resume listing his skills. Of the 10 points he listed, 9 were related to military engineering. Only in the 10th did he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he could also paint and sculpt. He promised Sforza portable bridges, methods for destroying fortresses, covered chariots, tanks, and catapults. Once hired, he set about designing these instruments of war. His tank was a tortoise-shell-shaped vehicle reinforced with metal plates, driven by men inside turning cranks to power the wheels, and ringed with cannons. It had a flaw in the gearing that would have made the wheels turn in opposite directions, rendering it immobile. Some historians suggest this was a deliberate sabotage by Leonardo, a pacifist at heart who hated the beastly madness of war, to prevent the machine from actually being used. He designed a giant crossbow not to be held by a man, but to be mounted on a carriage intended to fire massive stones or incendiary bombs to terrify the enemy. He designed the Scythe chariot, a gruesome revisiting of Roman warfare with spinning blades to mow down infantry. Yet, amidst these weapons, he also designed defensive systems. He conceptualized modern fortifications with angled walls to deflect cannonballs, a departure from the tall, vertical medieval castle walls that were easily shattered by artillery. Beyond warfare, Leonardo was obsessed with automation and labor-saving devices. He designed a self-propelled cart, often cited as the first automobile, powered by coiled springs. He designed a robotic knight, a suit of armor filled with gears and pulleys that could sit, stand, and move its arms, created to entertain the Sforza court. He improved the designs of textile machines, creating a needle-sharpening machine that, had it been built, would have made him a wealthy industrialist. He was fascinated by friction and ball bearings, incorporating them into his designs to reduce wear and increase efficiency, concepts that are standard in modern mechanics. Civil engineering was another major focus Leonardo was obsessed with. Water. He designed locks for canal systems in Milan to navigate elevation changes, inventing the mitre gate still used in the Panama Canal today, which utilized the pressure of the water itself to keep the gate sealed tight. He dreamed of reshaping the landscape, proposing to divert the Arno River away from Pisa to cut off the city's access to the sea. During a war with Florence, the project was attempted by Machiavelli but failed due to poor implementation by the contractors, not the design itself. Perhaps his most ambitious engineering dream was the ideal city. After the plague devastated Milan in 1484, Leonardo realized that the cramped, filthy medieval streets were breeding grounds for disease. He sketched a city designed for sanitation and efficiency. It was a two-tiered city, the upper level for pedestrians and the nobility, bathed in sunlight, and the lower level for canals, wagons, and the transport of goods. He included slanted streets for drainage into the canals and air vents to circulate fresh air into the lower levels. It was a vision of urban planning that prioritized public health and logistics. Centuries ahead of the modern metropolis, it is important to note that many of these machines existed only on paper. The metallurgy and power sources, steam or electricity, required to make them practical did not exist. Leonardo was limited by the muscle power of humans and animals. Yet, His sketches show a fundamental understanding of gears, levers, pulleys, and the transmission of energy. He was an engineer of the future trapped in the technology of the past. His dreams were not idle fantasies. They were blueprints for a world that wouldn't arrive for another 100 years. Chapter 6. The Power of Curiosity, Questioning Everything. This chapter serves as the philosophical pivot of the book. Having explored his art, anatomy, and engineering, we now examine the fuel that powered the engine, curiosity. Leonardo da Vinci's curiosity was not merely a personality trait, it was a discipline, a compulsion, and a survival mechanism. While most adults lose the child's habit of asking why, Leonardo sharpened it into a razor. This chapter analyzes the nature of his questioning, his to-do lists, and how his refusal to accept authority defined the Renaissance mind. The best evidence of Leonardo's voracious mind is found in his to-do lists. Tucked away in the corners of his notebooks are reminders that range from the mundane to the cosmic. A single page might contain a shopping list for grain, salad, and wine next to a note to describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Why did he need to know what a woodpecker's tongue looked like? There was no practical application for this knowledge. He wasn't painting a woodpecker. He wasn't building a machine based on it. He wanted to know simply because he did not know. The answer, which he eventually found, is that the tongue is so long it wraps around the bird's skull to cushion its brain. From the impact of pecking, a marvel of biomechanics. Closing parenthesis. Other entries on his lists are equally staggering. Go to the moat and see the flying fish. Ask the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a triangle. Get the measurement of the sun promised me by Maestro Giovanni. Find out how the atmosphere is composed. These lists reveal a man who viewed the world as a vast library, where he had not yet read all the books. He was constantly seeking out experts, travelers, soldiers, ditch diggers, and courtiers to extract their specific knowledge. He did not let his lack of formal education stop him. Instead, he treated every interaction as a tutorial. Leonardo's curiosity was also characterized by a profound skepticism of established dogma. In the 15th century, knowledge was largely based on authority: the Bible, Aristotle, and Galen. If Aristotle said it, it was true. Leonardo rejected this. He wrote, "Anyone who conducts an argument by appealing to authority is not using his intelligence. He is just using his memory." He was a proponent of sperienza, experience and experiment. When he found fossilized shells on the tops of mountains in Lombardy, the church and popular opinion held that they were carried there by the great flood of Noah. Leonardo looked closely. He saw that the shells were intact, not crushed by violent waves, and that they were found in layers, indicating a slow accumulation over time. He correctly deduced that the mountains had once been the floor of the sea, raised up over eons. By simply looking and asking, "Does this make sense?" he dismantled the geological timeline of his era. This relentless questioning extended to himself. He was constantly testing his own theories, revising them when new evidence appeared. His notebooks are full of corrections. He would write false next to an earlier theory about water pressure or light optics. He was not afraid to be wrong. He was afraid of remaining ignorant. However, this curiosity was a double-edged sword. It was the root of his notorious procrastination. He often failed to finish commissions because his curiosity led him down a rabbit hole. When commissioned to paint the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, he spent years studying the geology of the rocks in the background and the optical properties of the atmosphere, frustrating his patrons. For Leonardo, the painting was never the final goal. The painting was merely a byproduct of the investigation. Once he had solved the intellectual problem how to render the reflection of light on a curved surface, for example, the actual act of painting it became tedious. Chapter 6 argues that this failure to finish was actually a triumph of the mind. Leonardo prioritized the pursuit of truth over the production of goods. His legacy teaches us that curiosity requires courage. It requires the willingness to look foolish, to ask basic questions, and to challenge the consensus. In a modern world often obsessed with specialization, Leonardo stands as the ultimate testament to the power of generalism, the belief that everything is interesting and everything is connected. His mind was a sieve through which the entire universe passed, and he was determined to catch every golden nugget of truth, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Chapter 7: Inventing Flight, Wings, Gliders, and Vision. Of all Leonardo's obsessions, none soared higher literally or metaphorically than his dream of human flight. While others looked at the sky and saw the heavens, Leonardo saw a fluid medium subject to physical laws, navigable by man. Chapter 7 chronicles his lifelong quest to conquer the air, a journey that moved from romantic imitation of birds to a rigorous study of aerodynamics, culminating in designs that prefigured the hang glider and the helicopter. Leonardo's fascination with flight began in his childhood in Vinci, observing the kites and falcons riding the thermal currents. Unlike the myth of Icarus, which viewed flight as a hubristic transgression against the gods, Leonardo viewed it as a mechanical problem to be solved. He wrote, "A bird is an instrument working according to mathematical law, which instrument it is within the capacity of man to reproduce." This statement completely demystified flight. It wasn't magic, it was mechanics. His early designs from the 1480s were primarily ornithopters, machines designed to flap wings like a bird. He designed complex systems of pulleys and cranks, intended to be strapped to a man's back. The pilot would lie, prone or stand upright, using his arms and legs to pump the wings. Leonardo spent pages calculating the muscle power of a human versus a bird. He eventually realized a crushing physiological truth: humans have strong legs, but weak chests relative to their body weight. A bird's pectoral muscles are massive compared to its size. A human simply cannot generate enough lift by flapping wings. This realization led to a shift in his thinking. If he couldn't flap, perhaps he could glide. He began to observe how birds stayed aloft without beating their wings. Studying the physics of the wind, he noted how birds adjusted their tails and wingtips to stabilize themselves in turbulence. He wrote about the resistance of the air, understanding that air was a substance that could support weight. If the surface area was large enough, this led to his designs for fixed-wing gliders. These drawings are startlingly modern, resembling the hang gliders of the late 20th century. He designed wings made of light wooden frames covered in treated silk or linen, with controls for the pilot to shift their center of gravity, the exact principle used in modern hang gliding. One of his most iconic designs from this period is the aerial screw, often cited as the ancestor of the helicopter. It featured a helical linen sail draped over a wire frame. Leonardo theorized that if turned fast enough, the screw would bore into the air and lift the machine. While the physics were sound in principle, the concept of lift the machine would never have flown. The torque would have spun the platform in the opposite direction of the rotor, requiring a tail rotor, which he didn't include, and human muscle power was insufficient to generate the necessary RPM. Yet, the vision of vertical takeoff was there. Leonardo did not just draw, he experimented. He built models of wings and tested them. There are persistent legends, though no definitive proof, that he attempted a test flight of one of his gliders from a hill near Florence, Mount Cecere, piloted by his assistant Tommaso Massini, known as Zoroastro. The legend says the machine flew briefly before crashing, breaking Zoroastro's leg. Whether true or not, the story underscores the risk and ambition of his endeavors. He also concerned himself with pilot safety. He designed an early parachute, a pyramid-shaped tent of linen, writing, "If a man have a tent made of linen of which the apertures have all been stopped up, and it be 12 broccie across and 12 in depth, he will be able to throw himself down from any great height without suffering any injury into 1,000. A British daredevil built a parachute to Leonardo's exact specifications and jumped. It worked perfectly, proving that Leonardo understood the principles of drag and air resistance. 5 centuries before the first successful parachute jump, Leonardo's studies on flight are a testament to his resilience. He failed to fly. He spent decades on a quest that was technologically impossible in his time. Yet, his failure was magnificent. He identified the principles of aerodynamics: lift, drag, and thrust. He understood that the air was a fluid. He realized that the secret lay in the shape of the wing, the airfoil. He looked at the impossible and saw it merely as unfinished. Chapter 7 concludes that while the Wright brothers are credited with the first flight, Leonardo da Vinci was the first human to truly understand how to fly. Chapter 8, Scientific Journals recording thought and discovery. The final chapter of the infinite canvas turns to the physical legacy of Leonardo's mind. His notebooks, if his paintings are the public face of his genius, his journals are the private engine room. Over 7,000 pages survive perhaps only a quarter of what he actually wrote. A chaotic, beautiful, and dense repository of a lifetime of thinking. This chapter explores the history, content, and unique nature of these codices, arguing that they constitute the most significant unpublished work in the history of science. Leonardo's habit of keeping notebooks began in Florence and continued until he died in France. He used them to record everything: drafts of letters, sketches for paintings, accounting records, dirty jokes, philosophical musings, and groundbreaking scientific theories. He wrote in mirror script, writing from right to left, so that it could only be read easily with a mirror, while some have speculated this was to keep his ideas secret from the church or rivals. The more likely explanation is practical. Leonardo was left-handed. Writing left to right with a quill and ink would have caused him to smudge the wet ink with his hand. Writing right to left prevented this. The notebooks are not organized. They are a stream of consciousness. A page might contain a sketch of turbulence in water next to a drawing of an old man's face, overlaid with geometry calculations and a grocery list. This lack of structure reflects the interconnected nature of his mind. He did not compartmentalize knowledge. To him, the curl of a flower and the geometry of a church dome were related problems. The major codices such as the Codex Atlanticus, the Codex Leicester, and the Codex Arundel have traveled a perilous path through history. After Leonardo died in 1519, they were left to his faithful pupil, Francesco Melzi. Melzi treasured them, but after his death, his heirs did not understand their value. Pages were sold off, cut up, or given away as curiosities. Pompeo Leone, a sculptor, later acquired many and attempted to organize them, often pasting unrelated pages together, destroying the original order. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began to systematically study and translate them, realizing the magnitude of what had been lost. The Codex Leicester, owned by Bill Gates, focuses largely on water, astronomy, and geology. In it, Leonardo correctly theorizes that the ghostly glow on the dark part of the crescent moon is caused by sunlight reflecting off the Earth's ocean's earthshine. Centuries before Kepler explained it, the Codex Atlanticus is the largest set, housing his spectacular drawings of machines and weapons. The Windsor collection contains his anatomical studies. These journals reveal the tragedy of Leonardo's perfectionism. He constantly planned to organize his notes into treatises on painting, anatomy, and physics, but he never did. He was always too busy discovering the next thing to organize the last thing. As a result, his scientific discoveries had almost no impact on the scientific progress of his time. His laws of friction were rediscovered by Amontons centuries later. His medical discoveries had to be rediscovered by Gray and others. He was a man shouting into a void. His genius trapped between the covers of his private books, however, viewing the notebooks merely as lost science misses the point. They are a work of art in themselves. They demonstrate the visual thinking that defines Leonardo. He could not think without drawing. The sketches are not illustrations of the text. The text is an explanation of the sketches. Chapter 8 concludes by positioning the notebooks as a monument to the human intellect. They teach us that the act of recording one's thoughts, of sketching one's observations, is a vital part of understanding the world. They are the raw, unfiltered map of a genius mind at work, messy, brilliant, unfinished, and infinitely inspiring. In reading them, we are not just learning facts, we are learning how to think. Chapter 9, The Art of Perfection, Painting and Perspective. The artistic legacy of Leonardo da Vinci is often defined by a meager quantity of completed works, yet the qualitative magnitude of his output is sufficient to eclipse entire centuries of artistic endeavor. To understand Leonardo's approach to painting is to understand that he did not view art as a distinct discipline separate from the investigation of reality. For him, painting was a science, the supreme science, because it required the artist to comprehend the fundamental laws of nature before replicating them. Chapter 1, The Art of Perfection, explores the rigorous methodology, the obsession with mathematical perspective, and the relentless pursuit of visual accuracy that characterized his oeuvre. Leonardo's journey toward perfection began with the mastery of perspective, a mathematical technique that had been codified by earlier Renaissance masters like Brunelleschi and Alberti, but was refined to an unprecedented degree by Da Vinci. Linear perspective, the method of creating the illusion of depth on a flat surface using a vanishing point, was merely the starting point. Leonardo introduced the concept of aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective. He observed keenly that the atmosphere is not transparent. It has density and color. Therefore, objects at a distance do not merely become smaller, they become less distinct, their edges blur, and their colors shift toward blue. This observation is vividly present in the background of the Annunciation and the Virgin of the Rocks, where the distant mountains dissolve into a hazy, ethereal azure, creating a profound sense of immense space that was previously absent in Western art. This obsession with optical truth extended to the geometry of composition. One cannot discuss his perfectionism without analyzing the Last Supper, painted on the refractory wall of the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan. This fresco is a masterclass in narrative tension and geometric stability. Leonardo utilized a one-point linear perspective so strict that every line in the ceiling and the tapestries converges directly behind the right eye of Christ. This was not an aesthetic choice, but a theological one. It centered Jesus as the literal and figurative vanishing point of the world. The chaos of the apostles reacting in shock to the announcement of betrayal is contained within a strict mathematical order, symbolizing the eternal calm of the divine amidst the turbulence of the human condition. Furthermore, Leonardo's pursuit of perfection was often his own undoing. He was notorious for leaving works unfinished non finito, a habit born not of laziness, but of an inability to reconcile his perfect mental image with the limitations of his hand and materials. He would often stare at a canvas for hours, make a single stroke, and then leave. He believed that art is never finished, only abandoned. This psychological barrier is evident in the adoration of the Magi, a chaotic, swirling underpainting that reveals his thought process more clearly than many finished works. It shows a mind teeming with ideas, constantly revising the positioning of figures, the expression of horses, and the interplay of light, ultimately overwhelming the artist's capacity to finalize the image. The chapter also delves into his technical experimentation. Leonardo was dissatisfied with the quick-drying nature of fresco, which demanded rapid execution. He desired the time to blend, to layer, and to perfect. This led him to experiment with oil tempera mixes on dry plaster for the Last Supper, a disastrous technical failure that caused the painting to deteriorate within his own lifetime. Yet, this failure highlights his defining trait, the refusal to accept established methods if they hindered the pursuit of his specific vision of perfection. Ultimately, Leonardo's art was a quest to capture the intentions of the soul. Through the precise rendering of the body and the environment, he studied the mechanics of a smile, the tension of a tendon, and the geometry of light falling on a sphere, all to create a reality more potent than nature itself. His perfectionism was not merely about aesthetic beauty. It was about truth as scientific truth rendered in pigment and oil. Chapter 10, The Mona Lisa, Genius Captured on Canvas. Among the pantheon of human artistic achievement, one image stands unrivaled in its ubiquity and its power to captivate the collective imagination: the Mona Lisa. Housed behind bulletproof glass in the Louvre, La Gioconda is more than a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant. It is the culmination of Leonardo da Vinci's lifelong inquiry into optics, anatomy, geology, and psychology. Chapter 2, The Mona Lisa, Genius Captured on Canvas, dissects this masterpiece not as a pop culture icon, but as the supreme synthesis of Leonardo's intellectual universe. The painting's most discussed feature, the enigmatic smile, is the direct result of Leonardo's anatomical dissections. Leonardo had spent years peeling away the skin of cadavers to understand the muscles of the face. He identified the specific muscles responsible for lifting the lips, the zygomaticus major, and those that crinkled the eyes. In the Mona Lisa, he utilized this knowledge to create an expression that is physiologically accurate, yet psychologically ambiguous. The smile appears to flicker. When one looks directly at her mouth, the smile seems to vanish, hiding in the shadows. When one looks at her eyes, the smile re-emerges in the peripheral vision. This is a deliberate manipulation of human visual perception, exploiting the difference between foveal focus, detail-oriented, and peripheral vision, shadow-sensitive. Leonardo did not just paint a smile. He painted the mechanism of a smile interacting with the mechanism of the viewer's eye. Technically, the portrait is the ultimate demonstration of sfumato, a technique Leonardo described as without lines or borders. In the manner of smoke, there are no hard outlines in the Mona Lisa. The corners of her eyes and mouth are built up with dozens of layers of semi-transparent glaze, some no thicker than a few microns. This layering allows light to penetrate the paint and reflect off the white primer underneath, giving the skin a luminous, living quality. The transition from light to shadow is imperceptible, mimicking the soft diffusion of light in the real world. This technique imbues the figure with a sense of volume and breadth, removing the artificiality that characterized earlier portraiture. The landscape behind the figure is equally significant and often overlooked. It is not a pastoral Tuscan backdrop, but a primordial, craggy environment composed of jagged mountains, winding rivers, and a bridge. This background connects the sitter to the cosmos. Leonardo viewed the human body as a microcosm of the earth, the macrocosm. Just as the earth has rocks, the body has bones. As the earth has rivers, the body has veins. By placing Lisa against this turbulent, watery landscape, he visually links the flow of her blood to the flow of the water, and the permanence of her bones to the endurance of the mountains. The winding path on the left and the bridge on the right suggest a passage of time, placing the fleeting human life within the vast scale of geological time. Furthermore, the composition breaks from tradition. Leonardo presents the subject in a three-quarter pose, turning toward the viewer, which introduces a dynamic engagement previously unseen. The framing originally included columns on the sides, now cut down, suggesting she is sitting on a loggia, yet the interaction feels intimate. Her hands, resting softly on the arm of the chair, are rendered with exquisite anatomical precision, showing the underlying bone structure and the softness of the flesh, reinforcing the sense of relaxed, self-possessed agency. Why did Leonardo never deliver this painting to his patron? He kept it with him until he died in France. It is likely that the Mona Lisa ceased to be a commission and became a personal testament, a living document of his learning. As his understanding of light and anatomy deepened, he continued to refine the painting. It stands, therefore, not just as a portrait of a woman, but as a portrait of Leonardo's mind, a fusion of art and science, observation and mystery, forever suspended in a state of perfect becoming. Chapter 11: Anatomy and Biology, Understanding Life. While the world heralded Leonardo as a painter, his private notebooks reveal a man who was arguably the greatest anatomist of the Renaissance. At a time when medicine was often governed by superstition and rigid adherence to ancient texts, like those of Galen, Leonardo da Vinci took a knife to the human form to see the truth for himself. Chapter 3: Anatomy and Biology, Understanding Life explores Leonardo's gruesome, clandestine, and scientifically revolutionary exploration of the human body. Leonardo's anatomical studies began as a necessity for his art to paint the human form. One must know what lies beneath the skin. However, his curiosity quickly outpaced artistic utility. He performed over 30 dissections of human cadavers, ranging from young children to centenarians. This was gruesome work, undertaken in the absence of refrigeration or preservatives, often by candlelight in the depths of winter to slow decomposition. Yet, the drawings that resulted from these sessions are things of haunting beauty and staggering accuracy. Why? He invented the technique of the exploded view, drawing components separated from each other to show how they fit together, a method still used in engineering and medical manuals today. One of his most profound contributions was his study of the heart. While accepted wisdom held that the heart was a furnace warming the blood, Leonardo identified it correctly as a muscle and a pump. Through his studies of hydrodynamics, he deduced the function of the heart valves. He observed how the blood swirled in the aortic valve, creating vortices that helped close the valve flaps, a mechanism that was not fully confirmed by modern cardiology until the 20th century. His drawings of the heart are so precise that they have been used to guide modern heart surgeons. He mapped the coronary arteries and famously described the heart as a vessel of dense muscle, nourished by artery and vein as are the other muscles. Leonardo also sought the seat of the soul. He was not merely cataloguing parts, he was trying to understand the mechanism of life itself. In his famous Great Lady dissection, he revealed the anatomy of the female torso, though his understanding of the female reproductive system remained heavily influenced by animal anatomy, as human female cadavers were harder to obtain. Conversely, his drawing of the fetus in the womb is a masterpiece of biological illustration. It depicts the fetus curled perfectly within the uterus, capturing the profound mystery of gestation with a tenderness that belies the clinical nature of the dissection. He correctly noted that the fetus does not breathe, but receives nourishment through the umbilical cord. Beyond human anatomy, Leonardo was a comparative anatomist. He studied horses, bears, and birds, constantly drawing parallels between species. He famously compared the leg of a man to the leg of a horse, noting that the horse walks on its toes, and that what appears to be the horse's knee is actually the equivalent of the human heel. This comparative approach allowed him to understand the mechanical principles of locomotion, universal to all vertebrates. His studies extended to botany as well. Leonardo observed the branching patterns of trees, formulating what is now known as Da Vinci's rule of the trees, that the total cross-sectional area of branches at any height is equal to the cross-sectional area of the trunk. This was not just an aesthetic observation, but a hydraulic one, related to how sap moves through the plant. Ultimately, Leonardo's anatomical work was a search for the sensus communis, the place where the senses converged in the brain. He poured wax into the ventricles of an ox brain to model their shape, an early experiment in neuroanatomy, although his anatomical treatise was never published in his lifetime, lost to history for centuries. His work in Chapter 3 demonstrates a mind that refused to accept the surface of things, penetrating deep into the bloody, beautiful machinery of life to understand what it means to be a living, breathing being. Chapter 12, Mechanics and Hydraulics, Designing the Future. If Leonardo's art captured the soul, his engineering designs sought to master the physical world. He lived in an era of manual labor and limited mechanical advantage, yet his notebooks are filled with gears, levers, pulleys, and automated systems that anticipate the Industrial Revolution. Chapter 4, Mechanics and Hydraulics, Designing the Future, investigates Leonardo as the engineer par excellence, a man who viewed the universe as a grand machine governed by decipherable laws of force and motion. Leonardo's approach to mechanics was rooted in the breakdown of complex movements into simple elements. He systematically analyzed the components of machinery: the screw, the gear, the cam, the pulley, treating them as an alphabet of engineering. By combining these letters, he could write sentences of immense complexity. One of his most forward-thinking conceptualizations was the exploration of friction and ball bearings. He realized that friction was the enemy of efficiency and designed ball bearings to reduce wear and tear on rotating axles, a concept that is ubiquitous in modern machinery but was virtually unknown in the 15th century. His fascination with automation led to the design of the self-propelled cart, often cited as the world's first robot or automobile, powered by coiled springs similar to a clockwork mechanism and featuring a programmable steering mechanism using pegs. This device demonstrated his understanding of stored energy and control systems, while it was likely intended for theatrical entertainment rather than transport. The engineering principles were sound. Similarly, his design for a mechanical knight, a suit of armor capable of sitting, standing, and moving its arms via internal cables and pulleys, showcased his synthesis of anatomical knowledge. With mechanical application, however, it was in the realm of hydraulics and water management that Leonardo's engineering skills were most practically applied during his lifetime. Water was a source of endless fascination for him. He called it the wagoneer of nature, the vehicle of nature. He studied the flow of water with the same intensity he applied to the flow of hair or the drapery of cloth. He filled pages with sketches of vortices, eddies, and turbulence, attempting to mathematically codify chaos. This theoretical knowledge was applied to ambitious projects. In Milan and Florence, he worked on canal systems, locks, and dams. He designed the mitre gate for canal locks, a design utilizing the gates meeting at an angle to resist water pressure. This elegant solution is still the standard for canal locks worldwide, including the Panama Canal. He dreamt of diverting the Arno River to cut off Pisa's access to the sea during a war with Florence, a project that was attempted but failed due to poor implementation by others. Nevertheless, his plans for river navigability and irrigation showed a sophisticated understanding of topography and fluid dynamics. Perhaps his most iconic mechanical dream was that of human flight. Chapter 4 details his obsession with aviation. Leonardo did not just dream of flying. He studied the physics of it. He spent hours observing birds, noting how they utilized air currents and the geometry of their wings. His early designs were ornithopters, machines that flapped wings like a bird, powered by human muscle. Eventually, realizing that human musculature was insufficient for sustained flapping, he transitioned to fixed-wing glider designs which were far more aerodynamic and viable. His aerial screw, the precursor to the helicopter, while aerodynamically flawed due to the lack of a modern engine and anti-torque rotor, correctly grasped the principle that air has density and can be screwed into generating lift. Leonardo's machines were rarely built in his time. Metallurgy and power sources, steam or internal combustion, had not yet caught up to his imagination. Yet, looking at his designs for excavators, water lifts, and flying machines, we see a mind that refused to be tethered by the technological limitations of his century. He was designing the future, component by component. Chapter 13: Architecture and Urban Planning, Ideas for Cities. During the Renaissance, the city was a place of filth, plague, and congestion. Narrow medieval streets bred disease and stifled commerce. Leonardo da Vinci, having lived through the devastation of the bubonic plague in Milan in 1484, turned his intellect toward the built environment. He envisioned a city not as a static collection of houses, but as a functional, living organism that required circulation, sanitation, and order. Chapter 5: Architecture and Urban Planning, Ideas for Cities, examines Leonardo's visionary proposals for the ideal city, designs that were centuries ahead of their time in their consideration of hygiene and urban efficiency. Leonardo's critique of the medieval city was sharp. He despised the cramping of humanity, viewing it as the primary cause of sickness. His solution was a radical restructuring of urban space based on vertical integration and segregation of function. He proposed a multi-level city. In his sketches, the city is divided into two distinct tiers. The upper level, bathed in sunlight and fresh air, was reserved for gentlemen and the nobility to walk and socialize. It featured elegant palaces and wide piazzas. The lower level, connected to the canal system, was for commerce, carts, animals, and the transport of goods. This separation of pedestrian traffic from commercial and vehicular traffic is a cornerstone of modern urban planning. Yet, it was revolutionary in the 15th century. Leonardo understood that the efficiency of a city depended on its logistics. By using canals in the lower level, goods could be delivered directly to the basements of houses and shops, keeping the upper streets pristine. He incorporated spiral staircases to connect the levels, explicitly rejecting square staircases because the corners encouraged the accumulation of filth and unsanitary habits. Beyond the macro scale of the city, Leonardo reimagined the architecture of the home and the church. His architectural drawings are characterized by a love for central symmetry. He sketched numerous designs for centrally planned churches' domed structures with radiating chapels. That influenced his friend Donato Bramante in his design for St. Peter's Basilica. Leonardo's sketches show a deep understanding of load distribution and the structural forces acting upon domes and arches. He experimented with the inverted catenary arch, understanding that the perfect shape for an arch is the shape a chain takes when hanging freely. But inverted, sanitation was a primary driver of his domestic architecture. He designed stables with sloped floors for drainage and automated feed systems. He even sketched designs for a clean, ventilated toilet with a rudimentary flushing mechanism, recognizing that bad air miasma and waste were linked to poor health. His notes include dimensions for streets, dictating that a street should be as wide as the height of the buildings bordering it, a rule that ensures light and air reach the ground level, preventing the dark, damp tunnels common in medieval towns. Furthermore, Leonardo thought about the city in relation to nature. He did not see the city as a fortress against nature, but as a structure integrated with water. His plans for Romorantin in France, commissioned by King Francis I, envision a royal residence and town bisected by a complicated system of canals that served both aesthetic and sanitary purposes. He planned to divert a river to flush the streets and power mills. While his ideal city was never constructed in his lifetime, the cost and political will required to rebuild Milan were prohibitive. His ideas laid the groundwork for modern urban theory. He anticipated the zoning laws, the multi-level infrastructure like subways and overpasses, and the sanitation standards that defined the contemporary metropolis. Chapter 5 reveals Leonardo not just as an artist or inventor, but as a civic planner who believed that architecture ultimately shaped human behavior and health. Chapter 14, The Military Mind, Weapons and Strategies. There exists a profound irony in the life of Leonardo da Vinci. He was a man who famously bought caged birds just to set them free, a vegetarian who abhorred violence, and a pacifist who described war as potia bestialissima, beastly madness. Yet, for much of his professional career, his primary employment was as a military engineer. He served the warlord Cesare Borgia and the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, designing instruments of death with the same meticulous care he applied to the Madonna of the Rocks. Chapter 6, The Military Mind, Weapons and Strategies, navigates this moral paradox and explores the terrifying ingenuity of Leonardo's martial inventions. Leonardo's entry into the world of military engineering was a pragmatic one. In his famous resume letter to Ludovico Sforza, he listed 10 skills. 9 were related to military engineering: destroying fortresses, draining moats, building bridges, and only in the 10th point did he mention he could paint. He understood that in the fractured and warring states of Italy, princes needed weapons more than they needed portraits. His designs for weaponry were characterized by a desire to mechanize destruction and increase the shock and awe of warfare. The most famous of these is the armored car, often touted as the prototank, shaped like a tortoise shell to deflect enemy fire. It was ringed with cannons that could fire in a 360-degree radius. It was designed to break enemy ranks and sow panic. Interestingly, the schematics for the tank contain a fatal flaw. The gearing would have caused the front and rear wheels to rotate in opposite directions, rendering the vehicle immobile. Historians debate whether this was a genuine error or a deliberate act of sabotage by Leonardo, ensuring that if his plans were stolen, the machine would not work. He also revolutionized the design of artillery. The cannons of his day were cumbersome and slow to reload. Leonardo designed multi-barrel guns, the organ gun, which featured multiple barrels mounted on a carriage that could be fired sequentially or simultaneously. This anticipated the concept of the machine gun, prioritizing rate of fire over single-shot power. He also designed steam-powered cannons, the arc-et-tonnerre, and streamlined projectiles with fins for greater aerodynamic stability, applying his knowledge of fluid dynamics to ballistics. Beyond offensive weapons, Leonardo was a master of defensive fortifications. He realized that the tall, flat walls of medieval castles were vulnerable to the new, powerful cannons of the era. He proposed lower, thicker walls with angled bastions that trace Italian or Star Fort. These angled surfaces would deflect cannonballs rather than absorbing their full impact. He designed fortresses with rounded walls and intricate moats that could be flooded at will, turning the landscape itself into a weapon. His service to Cesare Borgia in 1502 saw him traveling as a military architect and mapmaker. It was here that he produced the map of Imola, a cartographic masterpiece. Unlike the pictorial maps of the time, which showed buildings in elevation, Leonardo created an ethnographic map, a flat, bird's-eye view plan of the city. He used a magnetic compass and odometer to measure distances precisely. This map was a military tool, allowing Borgia to understand the layout of the city for defense and control. But it also revolutionized the science of cartography. The chapter also touches upon his more gruesome concepts, such as the Scythe chariot, a horse-drawn vehicle with spinning blades, designed to sever the limbs of enemy infantry. These drawings are visceral and disturbing, showing severed bodies on the battlefield. They serve as a stark reminder that Leonardo's curiosity was neutral. He applied his intellect to the problem of killing with the same objective rigor he applied to curing. The military mind concludes by reflecting on the duality of his nature. Leonardo did not revel in war, but he was fascinated by the extremes of force. His military designs were exercises in mechanics and power. They remain a testament to the fact that genius is not inherently moral. It is a tool that can be used to paint a smile or design a slaughter. Chapter 15, Secrets of Light and Shadow, Innovation in Art. For Leonardo da Vinci, light was not merely a physical phenomenon designed to illuminate a subject. It was a divine substance, a medium of truth, and the very essence of visual perception. He wrote, "Shadow is the withholding of light." This simple observation underpinned a radical departure from the artistic norms of his time, while his contemporaries utilized light to create clarity and sharp outlines. Leonardo utilized it to create atmosphere, mystery, and volume. Chapter 7, Secrets of Light and Shadow, Innovation in Art, delves into his mastery of chiaroscuro and sfumato, techniques that fundamentally altered the course of Western art history. The chapter begins by defining chiaroscuro, light-dark. Before Leonardo, artists often modeled figures with a relatively flat lighting scheme. Leonardo pushed the contrast. He understood that to make a two-dimensional object appear three-dimensional, one must aggressively manipulate the transition from light to dark. His figures often emerge from a deep, velvety darkness. In the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, the rotundity of the forms, the knees, the faces, the arms is achieved not by lines, but by the gradation of shadow. He treated light as a physical force that wraps around an object, revealing its topography. However, his most significant innovation was sfumato, derived from the Italian word fumo, smoke. This technique involves the blurring of edges so that there are no harsh transitions between colors or tones. Leonardo observed that in nature, lines do not exist. A cheek does not end with a black line. It curves away from the eye until it disappears. To replicate this, he applied glazes of oil paint that were incredibly thin, building up shadows layer by microscopic layer. This required immense patience and a deep understanding of the chemistry of oil paints. This chapter analyzes St. John the Baptist, arguably his most extreme experiment in light and shadow. The figure emerges from an almost total blackness. The light source is soft and mystical, illuminating the saint's torso and face while his arm points upward into the dark void. The contours of the body are incredibly soft. The skin looks malleable. Here, Leonardo uses shadow not just to model form, but to suggest a spiritual mystery. The darkness is not empty. It is pregnant with the unknown. Leonardo also studied the optics of light scientifically. He filled notebooks with diagrams of light rays reflecting off curved mirrors, caustics, and passing through apertures, the camera obscura. He distinguished between original light, the light source, derived light, reflected light, and the interaction of colored light on surfaces. He noticed that a red object placed next to a yellow object would reflect red light onto the yellow surface, a phenomenon known as radiosity, which would not be fully appreciated in art until the Impressionists. The chapter further explores his observations on the color of shadows. He noted that shadows are rarely black. They are often tinged with blue, reflecting the sky or the complementary color of the light source. In his treatise on painting, he advised artists to avoid harsh sunlight and instead paint during the twilight hours, or on overcast days where the light is diffused and shadows are softest. This preference for soft, gentle lighting gave his paintings their characteristic dreamlike quality. Leonardo's manipulation of light extended to the psychological. By obscuring parts of the image in shadow, he invited the viewer to complete the picture with their imagination. In the Adoration of the Magi, the background is a swirl of dark confusion, forcing the eye to focus on the illuminated triangle of the Virgin and Child. The shadows become a narrative device, separating the divine clarity from the chaotic human ignorance. Ultimately, Chapter 7 posits that Leonardo was the first artist to paint the air itself. He did not just paint objects in a vacuum. He painted objects bathed in an atmosphere of light and dust. His secrets of light and shadow were the result of a scientific inquiry into how the eye perceives the world, proving once again that for Leonardo, art was the daughter of nature and the cousin of science. Chapter 16, Philosophical Reflections, Mind, Soul, and Nature. Leonardo da Vinci is celebrated for what he made paintings and machines, but his true legacy lies in what he thought. Scattered throughout his thousands of pages of notebooks are not just diagrams, but aphorisms, riddles, fables, and deep philosophical musings. He was a thinker who sought to integrate the physical and the metaphysical. Chapter 8, Philosophical Reflections, Mind, Soul, and Nature synthesizes these fragmented thoughts to construct a picture of Leonardo's worldview of philosophy deeply rooted in the interconnectedness of the cosmos. The core of Leonardo's philosophy was the concept of the macrocosm and the microcosm. He believed that man is the model of the world. This was not a poetic metaphor, but a literal biological and geological belief. He wrote, "The ancients called man a lesser world, and certainly this name is well bestowed, because as man has in him bones that support and framework for the flesh, the world has its rocks that support the earth." He saw the circulation of blood in the body as mirroring the circulation of water in the rivers of the earth. This holistic view meant that studying geology was a way to understand anatomy, and vice versa. Everything was connected by the universal laws of nature. His religious views were complex and unconventional. While he painted religious subjects, he was not a traditional Catholic. He questioned the biblical flood, using his observations of fossilized shells found on mountain tops to argue that the earth was far older than the church claimed, and that the mountains had once been sea floors raised over eons. He was an empiricist who trusted experientia over dogma. He famously wrote, "Anyone who conducts an argument by appealing to authority is not using his intelligence. He is just using his memory." For Leonardo, nature was the true scripture, and observation was the only way to read it. The chapter explores his thoughts on the nature of the soul. Unlike the Neoplatonists of his time, who viewed the body as a prison for the soul, Leonardo saw the body as the marvelous instrument of the soul. He located the sensus communis, common sense, in the brain, believing it to be the physical seat of the soul where sensory inputs converged. He believed that the painter had a divine power because the painter could recreate God's creation. If the painter wishes to see beauties that charm him, it lies in his power to create them. He wrote, elevating the artist to a godlike status. Leonardo was also deeply concerned with the passage of time. His notebooks are filled with reminders of the fleeting nature of life. Iron rusts from disuse. Even so does inaction sap the vigor of the mind, he warned. He was driven by a terrified urgency to create and discover before his time ran out. His fascination with the destructive power of nature seen in his deluge drawings, which depict apocalyptic storms destroying the world, reflects a recognition of nature's indifference to human endeavors. He saw nature as both a nurturing mother and a cruel stepmother. Furthermore, the chapter touches upon his ethical stance, particularly his vegetarianism and love for animals. He would buy birds to release them, and he wrote with disdain about how humans treat animals, calling humanity the king of beasts because of our capacity for cruelty. The time will come, He wrote or is attributed to have said, "When men such as I will look upon the murder of animals as they now look on the murder of men." This compassion was integral to his philosophy of respecting life in all its forms. Finally, we examine his view on knowledge itself. He believed that all our knowledge has its origins in our perceptions. He was the first modern scientist in his reliance on empirical data. Yet, he also recognized the limits of human understanding. His famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man is not just a study of proportion. It is a philosophical statement placing man at the center of the circle, the divine, and the square, the earthly, bridging the gap between the finite and the infinite. Chapter 8 concludes that Leonardo's genius was not just in his skill, but in his mindset, a relentless, open-minded, and humble interrogation of the universe. He teaches us that the boundaries between art, science, and philosophy are artificial, and that to truly understand the world, one must look at it with the wonder of a child and the rigor of a scientist. Chapter 17, Challenges and Failures, Learning Through Setbacks. The historical perception of Leonardo da Vinci is frequently obscured by a golden haze of reverence. We view him as the ultimate polymath, a man for whom creation was effortless and whose intellect was infallible. However, a closer examination of his life reveals a narrative punctuated by significant professional failures, abandoned commissions, and technical disasters. It is precisely within these setbacks that the true texture of his genius is revealed. For Leonardo, failure was never a cessation of effort. It was an essential component of his empirical method, a necessary step in the relentless pursuit of understanding how the physical world operated. One of the earliest and most public of these setbacks occurred in 1481, when the Augustinian monks of San Donato Escopito commissioned the young Leonardo to paint the Adoration of the Magi. This was a prestigious opportunity for an artist seeking to establish his reputation in Florence. Leonardo approached the task with characteristic ambition, filling his preparatory drawings with a chaotic energy, a swirling vortex of figures, animals, and architectural ruins that threatened to overwhelm the traditional biblical narrative. He sought to capture the entire psychological spectrum of humanity in response to the divine presence. Yet, the painting was never finished. When Leonardo abruptly left for Milan, he left behind a brown underpainting, a ghostly schematic of unfulfilled promise. To the monks, this was a breach of contract. To history, it is a masterpiece in flux. The failure to complete the commission suggests a mind that was often more captivated by the conceptual problem-solving of a composition than by the tedious execution of the final product. Perhaps the most notorious technical failure of his career was the mural of the Battle of Anghiari in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Commissioned to depict a glorious Florentine victory, Leonardo decided to experiment with a wax-based technique inspired by the ancient Roman writer Pliny. He sought to avoid the limitations of traditional fresco, which required painting on wet plaster and drying quickly. Leonardo wanted time to blend, time to revise, time to achieve the smoky sfumato transitions he perfected in oil. However, the experiment was a disaster. The paint refused to dry properly. It dripped and ran, the colors merging into a muddy slurry. In a desperate attempt to save the work, braziers were brought in to heat the wall. But this only caused the upper sections to melt while the lower sections dried unevenly. The work was ruined, eventually covered by later frescoes by Vasari. Yet, the preparatory sketches that survive show a dynamism and fury of war that influenced artists like Rubens centuries later. The failure of the medium did not negate the triumph of the conception. Even his sculptures were haunted by the specter of the incomplete. The project of the Gran Cavallo, a colossal bronze horse intended to honor Francesco Sforza, consumed years of his life in Milan. Leonardo produced a massive clay model that stunned contemporaries with its scale and anatomical precision. He designed intricate molds and furnaces to cast the beast in a single pour, a metallurgical feat never before attempted. But history intervened. As French troops threatened Milan, the tons of bronze set aside for the horse were diverted to cast cannons. The clay model was eventually used as target practice by invading archers and destroyed. The horse was a victim of the very political turbulence Leonardo tried to navigate, a grandiose dream pulverized by the reality of war. It is crucial to understand that Leonardo did not view these instances as failures in the modern, pejorative sense. His notebooks reveal a man who treated art as a branch of natural philosophy. If a painting technique failed, it was a chemical result to be noted. If a flying machine failed to generate lift, it was a lesson in aerodynamics. His procrastination, often bemoaned by his patrons, was a symptom of his perfectionism and his distraction by other phenomena. He might pause in painting a hand to dissect a cadaver to better understand the flexor tendons, or stop painting a landscape to study the geological strata of a rock formation. Ultimately, Leonardo's setbacks teach us that the path to innovation is rarely linear. His willingness to experiment with the unknown, even at the risk of public embarrassment or financial loss, defined his career. He learned that nature could not be conquered, only understood. Every abandoned canvas and broken machine was a testament to a reach that exceeded his grasp, a necessary friction in the honing of a mind that sought to encompass the infinite variety of the universe. Chapter 18: Patronage and Politics, Working for Kings and Dukes. The Renaissance artist was not a solitary figure toiling in a garret, free from the constraints of society. He was, by necessity, a courtier, dependent on the largesse of the wealthy and powerful. Leonardo da Vinci's career is a masterclass in navigating the treacherous currents of patronage and politics in an Italy fractured by warring city-states and foreign invasions. To secure the freedom to pursue his diverse interests from anatomy to hydraulic engineering, Leonardo had to sell his services to some of the most ruthless and ambitious men of his age. His departure from Florence to Milan in the early 1480s marks a pivotal shift in this dynamic. He wrote a famous letter of introduction to Ludovico Sforza, the de facto ruler of Milan, famously known as Il Moro. In this audacious resume, Leonardo did not primarily market himself as the artist who had painted the Annunciation. Instead, he listed his skills as a military engineer. He promised portable bridges, armored vehicles, cannons, and methods for destroying fortresses. Only at the very end of the list, almost as an afterthought, did he mention that he could also sculpt in marble, bronze, and clay, and paint as well as any other. Leonardo understood his audience. Ludovico was a man whose power rested on military might, and Leonardo tailored his pitch accordingly. This pragmatic approach secured him a position at the Sforza court, where he would remain for nearly 2 decades. Life at the Milanese court required extreme versatility. Leonardo was not just an engineer and painter, he was an impresario. He designed costumes for masks, created mechanical stage sets for festivals, and devised allegorical pageants to glorify the Sforza dynasty. While these ephemeral productions are lost to time, they were essential to his standing at court. They endeared him to his patron and provided the financial security that allowed him to fill his notebooks with observations on optics, botany, and fluid dynamics. The relationship was symbiotic. Ludovico gained the prestige of employing the most inventive mind in Italy, and Leonardo gained a laboratory. However, the reliance on patronage also meant vulnerability. When the French invaded Milan in 1499 and Ludovico fell from power, Leonardo was forced to flee. He became a wanderer, eventually entering the service of Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and the model for Machiavelli's The Prince. For a brief, intense period, Leonardo served as Borgia's chief military architect and engineer. He traveled across the Romagna, inspecting fortifications and drawing maps of unparalleled accuracy. His map of Imola, for instance, is a masterpiece of cartography utilizing a simplified, ethnographic plan that was revolutionary for its time. In Borgia, Leonardo saw a terrifying efficiency. In Leonardo, Borgia saw a tool for conquest. It was a dark alignment of genius and brutality, illustrating that Leonardo's curiosity was amoral. He was as interested in the trajectory of a cannonball as in the flight of a bird. Later in life, Leonardo found a different kind of patronage under the French King Francis I, the young monarch. Enamored with the Italian Renaissance, invited the aging master to France. installing him in the manor house of Clos-Luce near the royal chateau at Amboise. Here, Leonardo was finally granted the ultimate luxury, total freedom. Francis I did not demand paintings or war machines. He simply wanted the pleasure of Leonardo's conversation. He referred to Leonardo as father and allowed him to live out his days organizing his papers and contemplating the cosmos. This final chapter highlights the evolution of Leonardo's status. He began as a craftsman in Verrocchio's workshop, bound by guild rules and contracts. He became a court servant, trading his skills for protection. Finally, he ascended to the role of a royal philosopher, valued not for what he could produce but for who he was. Throughout these transitions, Leonardo remained shrewd. He knew that to study the circulation of blood or the geometry of a flower, he first had to ensure the circulation of gold from his patron's coffers. His political acumen was the armor that protected the fragile, solitary pursuit of his intellectual obsession. Chapter 19, Legacy in Ink and Paint, Preserving a Genius. While Leonardo da Vinci's reputation rests popularly on a handful of paintings, his true legacy is a fragmented, chaotic, and utterly magnificent corpus of paper. Legacy in Ink and Paint examines the dual nature of his output, the public triumphs of his easel works, and the private universe of his notebooks. These two streams of creativity were not distinct. They flowed into one another, the scientific observation informing the artistic execution, and the artistic visualization clarifying the scientific theory. The paintings, though few in number, fewer than 20, are universally attributed to him, changed the course of Western art. Before Leonardo, portraits were often stiff, linear, and brightly lit. With the Mona Lisa, Leonardo introduced a revolutionary atmospheric depth. He realized that in nature, outlines are not sharp. The air itself has density and color that obscures distant objects. This gave rise to his technique of sfumato, the smokiness that blurs the edges of forms, creating a sense of volume and living presence. The ambiguous smile of the sitter is not merely a stylistic choice, but the result of his anatomical studies of the facial muscles and nerves. He understood how the human face moves, and how emotion is registered in the micro-expressions of the mouth and eyes. Thus, the painting is a synthesis of optics, anatomy, and psychology. Similarly, The Last Supper broke with the static traditions of the Cenacolo genre. Instead of a row of quiet figures, Leonardo captured a moment of high drama, the specific instant after Christ says, "One of you will betray me." The mural is a study in reaction. Every apostle reacts differently based on their personality and age, creating waves of emotion that radiate outward from the calm center of Christ. It is a narrative painting that functions like a theatrical scene, grounded in Leonardo's deep observation of human gesture and body language. However, to look only at the paintings is to see only the tip of the iceberg, the submerged massive. His genius lies in the thousands of pages of his notebooks, written in his idiosyncratic mirror script. From right to left, these pages constitute one of the most remarkable records of a human mind ever preserved. They are a jumble of sketches, diagrams, shopping lists, philosophical musings, and rigorous scientific inquiries. On a single page, one might find a drawing of turbulence in water, next to a study of a braided wig, beside a geometry problem, and a recipe for salad dressing. This lack of organization was not clutter. It was a reflection of his holistic worldview. For Leonardo, the branching of a tree was analogous to the branching of blood vessels in the human body, which was analogous to the branching of rivers in a landscape. He saw patterns that connected the microcosm to the macrocosm. His drawings of the human fetus in the womb are works of immense beauty and scientific accuracy, correcting centuries of misconceptions. His studies of bird flight dissect the mechanics of lift and drag with a precision that anticipates modern aeronautics. The preservation of this legacy was precarious. After he died in 1519, his notebooks were bequeathed to his loyal companion Francesco Melzi. Melzi treasured them, but after his passing, the collection was dispersed. Pages were ripped out, sold to collectors, cut up for their drawings, or simply lost. What remains codices like the Codex Atlanticus in Milan or the Codex Leicester. owned by Bill Gates, is estimated to be only a fraction of what he produced. Yet, even in this fragmented state, the ink and paint tell a cohesive story. They reveal a man who believed that the highest function of the human spirit was to observe. Whether he was capturing the gleam of light in a woman's eye with oil paint, or sketching the valves of a pig's heart with pen and ink, the goal was the same: to render the truth of nature visible. This chapter argues that Leonardo's legacy is not just in the objects he left behind, but in the standard of inquiry he set, a standard that demands we look deeper, measure more continuously, and never cease to wonder at the complexity of the world. Chapter 20: Timeless Influence, Leonardo's Mind Across Centuries. The influence of Leonardo da Vinci is a phenomenon that transcends the typical boundaries of art history. While other Renaissance masters like Michelangelo or Raphael defined the aesthetic of their era, Leonardo's impact vibrates on a frequency that resonates uniquely with the modern world. Timeless Influence explores how Leonardo's mind has acted as a beacon across centuries, illuminating paths in disciplines that did not even exist during his lifetime. He is the original archetype of the Renaissance man, yet his relevance is startlingly futuristic. In the immediate aftermath of his death, his influence was primarily artistic. The Leonardeschi, a group of followers in Milan, mimicked his fumoto style and his sweetness of expression, often without understanding the underlying anatomical structure that gave Leonardo's figures their solidity. However, as his treatises on painting were circulated, though not published in full until much later, his theories on light, shadow, and perspective became foundational texts for the academies of Europe. Artists from Poussin to Rembrandt owe a debt to his rigorous analysis of how light interacts with matter. But as the Enlightenment dawned and the scientific revolution took hold, a different Leonardo emerged. As his notebooks began to be studied more systematically, scholars were stunned to find that this painter had anticipated key discoveries. In anatomy, he was the first to correctly describe the four chambers of the heart and the motion of the blood. Prefiguring Harvey, in geology, he observed fossils found on mountaintops and correctly deduced that the land must have once been submerged under the sea, rejecting the biblical flood theory long before the founders of modern geology. The 19th and 20th centuries saw Leonardo embraced as a prophet of technology. His sketches of flying machines, helicopters, the aerial screw, tanks, and diving suits became icons of human ingenuity. While most of these machines could not have flown or functioned due to the limitations of power sources and materials of his time, the engineering principles were often sound. He understood the need for gears, levers, and pulleys to convert energy. Inventors like Igor Sikorsky, a pioneer of the helicopter, acknowledged the spiritual lineage of Leonardo's aerial screw. Leonardo became a symbol of the limitless potential of the engineer's imagination. In the 21st century, Leonardo's influence has shifted again, this time toward systems thinking and biomimicry. Modern science is moving away from reductionism, breaking things down into parts toward understanding complex, interconnected systems. Leonardo was a systems thinker par excellence. He did not study a hand in isolation. He studied it in relation to the arm, the shoulder, the nervous system, and the mechanics of leverage. Today's scientists, grappling with climate change and ecological collapse, look to Leonardo's holistic view of the body of the earth. His understanding of water as the vehicle of nature, transporting nutrients and shaping the land, resonates with modern hydrology and environmental science. Furthermore, in the age of artificial intelligence and robotics, Leonardo's fascination with automatons is eerily prescient. He built a mechanical knight that could sit, stand, and move its arms, driven by a complex system of internal pulleys. This desire to replicate life through mechanics mirrors our current quest to create synthetic intelligence. He sought to understand the machinery of the human body so perfectly that he could recreate it. Ultimately, Leonardo's mind endures because it represents the ultimate convergence of the two cultures, the sciences and the humanities. In a modern educational landscape that often forces students to choose between STEM fields and the arts, Leonardo stands as a defiant proof that they are not mutually exclusive. He teaches us that the rigorous observation required for science is the same as the acute sensitivity required for art. His timeless influence lies in this challenge to integrate our knowledge, to see the beauty in the machine and the geometry in the flower, and to remain endlessly, voraciously curious.